Hi everyone. Welcome back to another story. No dialogues, no voiceovers. Only silence, choices, and the heavy weight behind them. Tonight's moment is not the end, but the beginning of something larger. A truth has been exposed, yet it hides even darker secrets. Tu Tieu and Uri must stand against shadows they cannot yet see. Watch carefully, because what lies ahead will change everything. The morning unfolded beneath a scorching sun, its heat pressing down until the air felt heavy. In that sweltering silence, Tu Tieu emerged with her familiar simplicity. She did not complain nor sigh. Instead, she bowed her head gently, offering wishes of health, peace, and happiness. In her unsettled life, those quiet blessings carried the weight of unspoken hope. The oppressive heat made every step feel heavier, yet Tu Tieu chose a different response. She turned to the gentle gifts of nature. On an old wooden table, she laid out lotus buds, rose petals, and dried chrysanthemum flowers, gathered and saved from days before. Their muted colors seemed to hold fragments of coolness, a small defense against the relentless sun. She rinsed the buds carefully, placed them into a glass pot, and poured boiling water over them. Steam curled upward, carrying a faint fragrance that drifted softly into the air. For a brief moment, silence wrapped around her like a gentle shield, easing the harshness of her reality. Minutes passed slowly, 10, then 15, until the tea was ready. She lifted the pot with both hands, her eyes glinting with a fragile brightness. In that simple act, it felt as if she had carved out a quiet joy for herself. Around her, life remained uncertain and harsh. Yet within this small ritual, she radiated a strength that seemed unshakable. There was resilience in her stillness and a quiet courage in her calm. It was as though, in creating this modest drink, she was also crafting a moment of peace that no hardship could steal away. The midday sun beat down harshly, casting sharp light onto the crooked walls around the modest bathhouse. Tu Tieu stood still for a moment, her eyes fixed on the roofless frame above. Under such heat, and with rains sure to come, this fragile place could never endure. The thought of shelter transformed slowly into determination. Quietly, she gathered materials, her steps heavy yet unwavering. Old wooden beams, dry bamboo poles, even rusted scraps of metal, all found their place in her arms. There was no laughter, no complaint, only silence pierced by her labored breaths. She measured the distances carefully, sawed each piece, her hands smeared with sweat and dust. The sharp strikes of her hammer rang out, colliding with the creak of bamboo being split. Each swing carried not just effort, but the weight of her burdens, as though every strike was a release of something long held inside. Slowly, the skeletal frame of a roof began to rise, fragile yet determined. Rough iron wires twisted tight around the beams, holding them fast against the unseen winds. In that moment, Tu Tieu was building more than a roof. She was carving out a fragment of faith that even within a life so uncertain she could endure, she could create a space of her own safety. Sweat dripped from her brow, but in her eyes there was a spark of quiet defiance. She stood there, small against the vast light, yet unyielding. Every lash of sun, every drop of sweat seemed only to prove that resilience was not always loud. Sometimes it was the silent resolve of one girl, building a shelter against both the storm outside and the storm within. By late afternoon, Egan's small room glowed softly with the golden light of candles. The old wooden table had been carefully cleaned, and on it lay a few simple dishes, humble yet heartfelt. There was no luxury here, only sincerity woven into every small detail. Tu Tieu sat quietly in a corner, her eyes following Egan's precise movements. The flickering flame cast his shadow against the wall, frail yet steadfast, as if to remind her that gratitude required no grand gesture. The modest meal began in silence. Chipped porcelain bowls were set upon the table, each one filled with steaming rice. The simple aroma spread through the room, filling the quiet with a gentle presence. Tu Tieu held her chopsticks with a faint tremor, her chest stirring with something unfamiliar. Warmth, the kind she had long forgotten how to feel. Egan raised a glass of clear water, his gaze turning toward Tu Tieu with a silent acknowledgement, a quiet gratitude that needed no words. In that fleeting moment, the invisible distance between them seemed to dissolve. They did not speak, yet their presence filled the silence more profoundly than language ever could. Outside, darkness crept across the sky, swallowing the last traces of day. But inside this small room, the light held steady, warm and unyielding. Amid uncertainty and hardship, Tu Tieu felt the faint yet undeniable truth that sometimes gratitude and human kindness alone could cast light into the deepest shadows of a life. Night had fallen, and the porch outside lay under a heavy, suffocating stillness. Inside Egan's small room, most of the candles had burned low, leaving only a faint, flickering glow on the walls. Tu Tieu sat by the window, her hand resting lightly on the cold glass, her gaze lost in the endless darkness beyond. In that fragile silence, a sudden knock at the door broke through, soft yet urgent, almost desperate. Both Egan and Tu Tieu startled, their breaths caught in the thick air. The atmosphere tightened, heavy with unspoken caution. Egan moved slowly toward the door, each step deliberate, burdened by a wary hesitation. When the door finally creaked open, the figure of a gaunt man emerged from the shadows of night, his face hollowed by hardship, yet his eyes burning with an untamed intensity. It was Alan. He stood motionless, as if weighed down by the journey he had endured. His clothes were disheveled, his hands trembling faintly, but his gaze carried something fierce, a mixture of resolve and regret. Tu Tieu's heart stirred violently as she recognized him. The man who had once drifted like a faint shadow in her past had returned, suddenly, into this fragile moment. In that instant, three fates converged in silence. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks of the door, carrying with it a sharp chill that seeped deep inside. Within these walls, however, another storm was beginning to form. An unspoken truth on the verge of breaking free. An arrival that would unsettle everything they thought had been left in peace. The room grew heavier as Alan stepped further inside. The flickering candlelight cast his shadow long against the floor, twisted and broken, mirroring the turmoil within. Egan remained still, his eyes sharp with suspicion, while Tu Tieu tilted her head slightly, studying every small movement of the man who had returned. Alan drew in a long breath, his shoulders trembling as though the weight of the past had suddenly crashed down on him. His gaze faltered, falling to the ground, as if he himself lacked the courage to confront what was now undeniable. Fragments of memory clawed their way back, blurred moments, fractured pieces, until the harsh truth stood before him. The instant when he had been left vulnerable, unconscious, only to awaken and find the gold and money gone. Betrayal burned through him, yet tangled with it was regret, for he knew the one who had taken everything had once been close, too close. Not a single word was spoken, but Alan's eyes told it all. A quiet storm of anger suppressed, pain buried, and shame impossible to disguise. In that gaze, Tu Tieu caught sight of something raw, a wound that had never healed, a truth that could barely be named. Egan, meanwhile, stood steady, his calmness edged with a quiet readiness, as though he waited for the moment when the truth would finally break free. Cutting through the fragile illusion of safety like a blade, the pale afternoon light slipped through the cracks of the door, painting Lan's face with a cold, gray shade. Her steps slowed as she stood before Alan, as if the air between them had thickened into something suffocating. Alan stood tall, his gaze restrained, yet beneath it lurked a storm waiting to break free. Lan's fingers intertwined tightly, trembling ever so slightly, betraying the unease she tried to conceal. Memories surged back, the moment her hand, cold and deliberate, searched through the pockets of the unconscious man, taking every coin of gold, every note of money, before walking away as if he were a stranger. It had not been mere desperation, it was a stain, a shadow that had haunted her since that day. Alan's eyes locked on hers, piercing through the fragile mask of excuses. The distance between them felt both near and impossibly far, like an abyss carved by shattered trust. In that suspended silence, Lan realized the truth she could no longer escape. What she once stole had returned, now transformed into a blade cutting into her own heart. No explanation left her lips. There was only silence, thick and suffocating, as her gaze faltered while Alan remained unmoved, standing like a living verdict, a mirror reflecting a guilt never absolved. And in that confrontation, the illusion of peace finally crumbled. Night fell, and the room sank into stillness, broken only by the steady ticks of the clock, each one striking against the unbearable tension. Uri stood frozen, his eyes tracing every movement of Alan and Lan. No words were needed. The truth was already there, unveiled in their stares, in the silence stretched beyond measure. Alan stepped forward, carrying the weight of betrayal in every breath. He needed no accusations, for his gaze alone was enough to strip bare the past Lan had tried so hard to bury. Uri's face wavered, torn between shock and pain. He could not believe that someone so close, someone he called family, could be entangled in such shadows. Lan bowed her head, her shoulders trembling beyond control. The walls she had built around herself crumbled in that instant, leaving her exposed, fragile, and defeated. Uri's eyes cut into her like a blade, drenched in hurt, desperate for an explanation, but she had nothing left to give. The silence deepened, heavy as a verdict. Alan turned away, leaving behind a truth that could never be erased. Uri remained, his gaze full of torment, caught between blood and betrayal, between forgiveness and an ache that refused to fade. In that moment, it wasn't only Lan who fell, it was trust itself, shattered into pieces too sharp, too broken, ever to be whole again. It seemed as if everything had ended in darkness, but in truth, it had only begun. The truth revealed tonight was not the final mark, but the first crack in a wall hiding far greater secrets. Uri stood there, heart bleeding, yet unaware that what he had just witnessed was merely the surface of something much deeper. Behind Alan, behind Lan, other unseen hands were pulling the strings in silence. A force not yet revealed, but already shaping the fates of everyone in its shadow. The path ahead for Uri and Tu Tieu would not only be about pain and betrayal, it would become a battle of survival against secrets too dangerous to remain unspoken.